Every single season, there ends up being a team or two that is a huge surprise to just about everybody, whether that come from more regular season success than anybody anticipated, or the team going further in the playoffs than anyone anticipated, like the Dallas Mavericks did last year. So the question of today's video is, what is going to be the surprise team of the 2024-2025 season? Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Buckets. Subscribe to the channel if you are over on YouTube and give us a like. We're trying to get 200k subscribers by the end of the year, and if you are enjoying this as an audio only experience over on Spotify, go ahead and give us a follow and a 5 stars. And if you want to enjoy this as an audio experience, that link will be the top one in the description. I have picked 7 NBA teams here that I think could be really surprising next year. Teams that have a lot of boom or bust potential, or boom or just plateauing basically as what they already were. These are naturally going to be a lot of teams that were not very good in the previous season. Now, the nature of a surprise team is that they're a surprise. Trying to predict surprises doesn't always go all that well. That said, I'm going to be making these predictions anyways. I did get it right one year, 2020, when the Grizzlies drafted Ja Morant. I said if they draft Ja and Ja ends up being pretty good out of the gate, then the Grizzlies could end up being a playoff team, and that's exactly what ended up happening. I also felt as the season was going along that Dallas this year could end up making a big playoff run, and they did, but that's not quite the same as calling it before the season even starts. But with that said, my 7 teams are the Charlotte Hornets, New Orleans Pelicans, Orlando Magic, Atlanta Hawks, Detroit Pistons, San Antonio Spurs, and Sacramento Kings. Of course, Sacramento Kings were a team that was a surprise team just a couple of years ago when they made the playoffs for the first time since like 2006, I think it was. Very long playoff drought, the longest standing one in the NBA at the time. They ended up missing the playoffs this previous season through the play-in tournament. They would like to see themselves back there. They signed DeMar DeRozan, which was one of the bigger moves of the offseason. I'm pretty high on the DeMar signing. I know that a lot of people didn't think that it made a whole lot of sense. You know, a dynamic shot creator on the wing isn't necessarily the first thing that you thought they needed. You'd lean more towards the defensive end of the floor. However, I think that his dynamicism as a shot creator, the fact that he's also a really good backdoor cutter, and that it also in Sacramento he would be allowed to have a more shot and scoring role rather than worrying about also being a playmaker or also being a bit of a defender at times. In Sacramento, I think there's very few fits that actually make sense for DeMar DeRozan, but this is one of them. If I had any major concern, it would be the fact that him and Sabonis on the floor at the same time means that you have 2 non-floor spacers. I'm not expecting Sacramento to go super far in the playoffs or anything like that. I'm more suggesting that they could probably end up being a top 5 team if this fit ends up working pretty well. Top 5 team in the conference, that is. I do think that even though they're both non-spacers, DeMar and Sabonis, they both have a good mid-range game, which isn't nothing, and they can use that for like handoff action, which obviously Sabonis is a big fan of. Cutting, as I previously mentioned. And then as for how this plays off of De'Aaron Fox, well, De'Aaron Fox just so happened to have the best 3-point shooting season of his career by a wide margin. Now, the downside of that is that his rim frequency has gone down year after year after year, which to some degree there is a natural element to that. You know, you come out of the gates as this young player who just can run endlessly, and you just want to run to the basket endlessly, and then you get older and wiser and a little bit more experience in the NBA, and you start, you know, picking your spots for things like that. But I do wish that De'Aaron went to the basket a little bit more than he does at this stage of his career. But because he has that 3-ball now, if that 3-ball didn't show itself last year and he was the typical 32-33% from 3 that he had been displaying up to this point in his career, then I would be worried about the fit. But I think the 3-ball is real, especially because not only did the percentage increase, the volume and the difficulty of his attempts increased rather dramatically. Spacing, I don't think, should be too much of an issue. They also have their bona fide shooters with Kevin Huerter, and Malik Monk can also be a really, really good 3-point shooter. Obviously, he brings more than just catch and shoot ability. Keegan Murray had a down year shooting the ball this previous year from his rookie year percentage-wise, but still quite a good 3-point shooter. I think they could have one of the best offenses in the NBA. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they had another record-setting offense. When they made the playoffs 2 years ago, they statistically statistically had the best offense in the NBA, but not just that, statistically the best offense in NBA history. So I think DeMar adds an interesting element to that. Obviously, you could argue like a Harrison Barnes just being there and catching, shooting threes is nice. It's nice to have someone who's just going to stand in the corner. But I think the fact that DeMar is going to be moving more, the fact that DeMar can attack from the perimeter, even if he can't hit that three, he can put more pressure on the defense just given the fact that he can do more than hit that three. I don't think they're going to be a good defense again. I don't think that's going to change with the DeMar signing, but I think the offense could be improved. The offense for them got left a little bit behind in the previous year. I think that DeMar just adds an extra element to this offense that if it hits, it could really hit. The San Antonio Spurs are a team that a lot of people are projecting to be in the playoff conversation. I think more people are projecting them to be in a play-in type of tier, but I actually think they could solidly be in a playoff spot, not just in the play-in, but like top 5 seed or higher. That might be a little bit bold, but probably more like 6. They'll probably end up being in a higher end playoff seed if I had to predict and play it a little bit more conservative. But if you told me that the San Antonio Spurs ended up being the 5 seed this year, I wouldn't necessarily be all that shocked. Obviously, this all hinges on the jump from Victor Wembanyama in year 2. Now, what's interesting is he had a second-year jump in the middle of his first year. If you look at his first half or so of his season versus his second half or so of his season, it's night and day in terms of the statistics, the box score stats, the efficiency. Also played a little bit more, which definitely didn't hurt. Defensively, all the advanced metrics suggest that Victor Wembanyama is already one of the 3 most impactful defenders in the entire NBA. I believe the statistics after his rookie year suggested he was the most impactful defensive player in the NBA. So Victor is already my pick for DPOY going into this year if you watch my award predictions video. And the thing about that is DPOYs pretty much always make the playoffs. There's only 2 or 3 times in NBA history where the Defensive Player of the Year award went to somebody on a team that was not featured in the postseason. So, by virtue of that prediction, we're also kind of predicting that he ends up being in a playoff spot, or he ends up being some major outlier as a DPOY without a playoff spot. But it's been a very long time since it's happened, and I don't anticipate it happening again. But his defense might be so fucking good you can't ignore it, but also the defense might be so fucking good that they end up making the playoffs as a result of it. So if Victor Wembanyama is a top 10 player in the NBA next year, I don't really think that would surprise anybody. I don't think most people have him in their top 10 right now at this very second, but if we're doing a top 10 now 2 months into the season at the start, a very early, probably a little bit undue reaction, I think a lot of people are going to be saying, man, he's kind of already here. Same thing happened with Luka Doncic his second year. It was like, well, we want to play it a little conservative and not say he's outright going to be a top 10 player in the league next year, but there's a very real shot that he will be, and in the case of Luka, he did. Feel the same way about Victor. Very real shot that he can just be a top 10 guy next year. That leads it to the rest of the team to essentially take this team further than just what Victor Wembanyama is capable of. Will Devin Vassell take further strides as a shot creator? Weirdly enough, his mid-range pull-up game is great, and his catch-and-shoot three-point game is great, but on the inverse of that, the catch and shoot mid-range, which is a lower frequency shot, but also the off the dribble 3 ball are actually pretty bad. So if those could improve, that would make a big difference. Like Vassell in the pick and roll with Wemby, if he can legitimately pull up from 3 out of it, he's probably going to get a lot of space off of that Wemby screen, given how much gravity Wemby has rolling to the basket, but also how much room could just be made purely off of the fact that Wemby takes up as much space as he does. CP3 is a very interesting one because he's at a stage of his career where essentially in terms of scoring the ball, he sometimes can do a mid-range pull-up and he sometimes can do a catch-and-shoot 3. Don't expect that man to get anywhere near the rim unless it's on a wide open fast break. Otherwise, jump shot, jump shot, jump shot, maybe a floater here or there if we're being generous. So we're not really looking to him to score. Also not really the defensive player, anywhere near the defensive player that he used to be, which is unfortunate. Just kind of naturally what happens if you decline athletically a little bit and you're only 6 feet tall. But one thing that he can still do is throw dimes. One thing he can still do is put the ball where it needs to be efficiently, no turnovers, nothing like that. I don't feel great about playmakers who can't score. That's kind of something that I have always had beef with. I also don't like scorers who can't play make very much. I really feel like you have to have a little bit of both to actually be a super effective on-ball creator. But I do think that Chris can ultimately be an improvement, especially given that half of the season, their fucking point guard was Jeremy Sohan. Speaking of Jeremy Sohan, if he could hit a corner three-pointer, that's all we're asking. If Jeremy Sohan could shoot 37% on open catch and shoot threes, huge difference maker. Huge difference maker. Unfortunately, he hasn't displayed that ability. His three-ball percentage did go up after his rookie year, but I don't have a lot of hope for that. And in terms of the other players on this team, I don't feel strongly in a good way about Keldon Johnson. I did a couple of years ago, but he's not a very strong defender. He is not a good playmaker, and his offensive game, his three-ball percentage dropped last year. Like, he's a fine forward to have, ideally in a situation where you have a lot of playmakers around him, so the fact that he can't do it doesn't hurt you too much. But now that you're going to have CP3 probably starting, and then you're going to have Trey Jones as well, you're going to have guys on the floor who might not be ideal playmakers for Victor given their lack of scoring gravity, but at the bare minimum, they are going to get him the ball at the right spots. And as we know, Victor as a lob target presents such an easy opportunity at the rim so consistently during the game that literally the difference between Chris Paul being able to make that pass and Jeremy Sohan not being able to make that pass might be a 6-point per game swing, honestly, and that makes a huge difference in the win column. So if the Spurs have a couple of things personnel-wise beyond Wemby actually go right, I think that paired with a big boost from him could be pretty nice. The Detroit Pistons are probably a shocking one to see here for a lot of people given how bad of a year they had last year, but I think they shed off a lot of their bigger issues. They did add some three-point shooting. They brought back Fontecchio. They brought in Tim Hardaway Jr. Obviously, not the cream of the crop in terms of shooting, but it is a rather significant improvement. Fontecchio was only there for like the last 30 games or so of the season, and I do think that spacing combined with hopefully better coaching from JB Bickerstaff should ensure that they have a much improved record. And given that the depth of the Eastern Conference isn't always the best, if you told me they got the 10th seed and then managed to make the playoffs through the play-in, I wouldn't necessarily be all that shocked. I feel like Cade Cunningham is like, how do I put this? Like, he's lying in wait. He's waiting to be unleashed from just a modicum of spacing out there. If you give him that, there is still some concerns because you have Asar Thompson and Ron Holland, who you're going to want to play both of them to some extent. If you give him enough space that he can start operating like most NBA players are allowed to operate, most ball handlers are allowed to operate, then that would give him the freedom to have a big year, a much improved year. His efficiency would no longer really be a question mark, I think. And you combine that with some of their other players getting a little bit better because they're naturally, they're a younger team. If they end up trading Jaden Ivey later down the line, I imagine they would make that move in exchange for someone else who can shoot the ball. Jaden Ivey is all right from three his rookie season, but he's definitely not a real spacer. I'm not going to talk too long about the Pistons, but I do think, given how awful their record was last year, it gives them a lot of room to grow. Like, technically 30 wins is a huge improvement from the season they played last year. I wouldn't be surprised if they got like 38 to 40 of them. And that ended up getting them in a playoff spot. I don't know if that is enough for it to be a huge surprise, because ironically, a lot of people were making these projections for the Pistons last year. I believe they started the season 2-2, and a lot of people were like really fucking hyped about that. And then after their 2-2 start, I think that's when their 28-game losing streak began. I think they were at such a low point that if they even resemble an NBA roster for a full year, that will be a huge jump, and for a lot of people, probably pretty surprising. The Atlanta Hawks are a team that I'm going to be watching rather closely this year, because I feel like this roster is more or less about what they had when they made the Eastern Conference Finals. I think Jalen Johnson basically replicates the type of production that John Collins was giving you at that time. I do think Clint Capella's notably worse than he was then, but also Onyeka Okongwu is notably better than he was then. He was a part of that. He was definitely a part of that roster, but I don't think he played much. While I do believe there is a definite ceiling to the Trae Young Helio ball, I also do think that it comes with a much higher floor than we ended up seeing from him and DeJounte Murray playing together. I think Trae, the last 2 years, has been not as good as he was otherwise because of having to share the floor and the ball with DeJounte. And I think if you take that aspect away, which obviously you're doing because they traded him to the Pelicans this offseason, then you're going to open yourself up to the possibility that, well, I don't think they're going to make an Eastern Conference Finals run because I think that was more a product of the collapse of the Sixers than it was the actual Hawks being amazing. That said, I think they can be a playoff team. In fact, I would probably predict them to be a playoff team. And if them being a playoff team makes them a huge surprise, then yeah, they would be my prediction. I don't think them being a playoff team alone is a huge surprise. If you told me they were the 5 seed, wouldn't say it's ridiculous. I really wouldn't. Because if Trae Young ends up having a career year, the roster around him isn't bad. I think Jalen Johnson's probably going to take another big jump this year. He was in MIP conversations last year. I do think that the Hawks could be pretty fucking good, especially if they go more Okongwu than Clint Capella. One could only hope. The Orlando Magic, I don't know how many people predicted them being a playoff team last year, but I don't know if their playoff appearance was enough to be an outright surprise, but it was definitely not the most anticipated thing in the world. So what I am suggesting here isn't a playoff spot because that would just be a repeat of what they did last year. Rather, I actually think they could end up being a high seed in the Eastern Conference. Now, when I say high, I mean like top 3. I don't think that would make them a top 3 team in the East. I think there are 4 teams that are just clearly going to be better than Orlando. However, that doesn't necessarily translate to a higher regular season record. I could see them having a better record than the Bucks, maybe even the Sixers, especially if Joel Embiid misses some time, because I'm expecting even further development from Paolo. And if Franz remembers how to shoot a 3-ball, man, that'll make a difference. Because I feel like Franz's game is one of the most well-rounded in the entire league, except for that 3-ball. And that's like the number one thing you don't want to not have. Yeah, don't want to not have. It's rather important that you have that 3-ball. And he shot like 31%. He shot well earlier on in his career, which is why it was so confusing. I think most people believe the shot will return. If it doesn't, we might actually have to start having some conversations, because I don't know if Franz can be around Paolo long term if his 3-ball is just non-existent. But I think Paolo's probably going to improve as a shooter a little bit. He improved a lot this previous year. Franz, I'm almost certain, will improve quite a bit. You add KCP, who is one of the better off-ball shooters in the entire league. And in general, 3-point shooting is the biggest problem for this team. It was the biggest thing that held them back from being much better than they already were last year. I think the defense, probably the same, if not better, because of KCP's presence. The 3-point shooting will be notably better. And I think that it's an improvement on the margins, but I think it's enough of an improvement within those margins that they could end up being one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference. Not a team that I would put in the contender category, but definitely a team that contenders would have no interest in playing. A team that contenders would be actively, losing games or whatever to try to avoid that matchup. They're one of the ones I'm higher on going into the year. The New Orleans Pelicans, I feel like they're the designated wait until they figure it out team in the NBA. They clearly have so much talent. They were one of the deepest teams in the league last year. But unfortunately, what comes from that is kind of a misunderstood hierarchy, not really clear who the better players and who gets more shots and all of that is necessarily. That can lead to issues. It also leads to a little bit of confusion about what the roster even actually ends up being. Not to mention the fact that everybody's getting hurt all the fucking time, especially Zion. That leads to confusion about what the roster ends up being. Zion had these photos come out. I don't love doing the off-season photo oh shit, they're gonna be crazy good next year because this guy looks really skinny in this one photo. But in the case of Zion, I think that matters more than just about any other player in the league. He looks really fucking skinny. He looks like he is in excellent shape versus where we have seen him at other stages in his career. So one could only hope that they remain healthy and Zion remains healthy throughout the year. There's been a lot of discussion about the fit with Brandon Ingram, whether or not it's actually a good fit, whether or not it will work when everybody's healthy. But I also feel like they haven't really had a chance to display that. So many people are jumping the gun to be like, well, Brandon and Zion don't play well together. Are we sure? Are we sure they don't in a better postseason setting? I think I saw Kenny say this in a video. I don't know if he was talking about the Pelicans, why he was talking about the Pelicans, but he was talking about the Pelicans and like their lineup with CJ, Ingram, and Zion was a -1. That's obviously not good, but they also still haven't had a ton of opportunity to play together, not any opportunity to see them in a playoff setting other than the one play-in game, if you consider that a playoff setting. So I think they still have a lot of potential. I think their wings will continue to improve. I think Trey Murphy, if he took a big leap, could make a real difference. So the Pelicans are kind of always going to be on my radar for the what if type of thing. Not exactly a great position to be in the NBA to constantly be like, well, they could be good, but it's better than just being bad, I guess. Last but not least, I want to talk about the Charlotte Hornets. If there was any beast lying in wake in the NBA, I think it's LaMelo Ball. I don't think a lot of people recognize how good LaMelo Ball is due to the fact that he never plays more than like 30 games. He has played only 60 games or more one time. He's never even reached the 65 game threshold. It's a threshold that's like a requirement for making all NBA teams and stuff. But if he played even 60 games, add on to that a second-year leap from Brandon Miller and some internal improvement, as I've said with everybody here, because a lot of these teams are younger teams. I actually think they could make a playoff spot in the East. Again, that's with the caveat that the East is not all that impressive to get the 7th, 8th seed in, but they have always been competitive with LaMelo Ball on the floor. And I think that this is probably the best roster that he has ever had around him. I don't feel great about the draft pick that the forward that they drafted. A lot of people didn't feel good about that because the dude's 3-ball just looks completely busted. But even if he doesn't end up being, a big minutes guy early on, I know people are going to laugh at this. Grant Williams was really good for Charlotte in his little stretch with them after being traded there. And I think he could end up being a pretty valuable role player for them. Mark Williams at the 5 spot is really good. I like Mark Williams a lot. Does a lot of the typical big man stuff really, really well. So I do think, push comes to shove, if Charlotte ends up being healthy, if LaMelo ends up being healthy, I'm going to say they'll be a playoff team. And I left them last because they are my biggest contender for this. Blind hope or blind faith or whatever. But I feel like LaMelo can only have so many seasons where he plays 30 games, and he's due for a bounce back. He's due for a full year of NBA basketball. And if he manages to get anything resembling that, again, I only say 60 games or so. I also think Brandon Miller is going to be a lot better in his second year. So all of those factors combined, the factor in the Eastern Conference, I think the Charlotte Hornets are going to be a playoff team next year. And that will surprise a lot of people if it does happen. If it doesn't, we can just pretend this video never happened. But if it does, I will be sure to brag about it. That is it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, but that is it. Goodbye.